Hello, my name is Elizabeth Matka. This is the fifth in our series of seminars, which offers an opportunity for dialogue, exploring, challenging and critiquing historical and contemporary notions of mental health. In each seminar, an individual who has made a valuable contribution to the area of mental health is invited to converse with an interdisciplinary audience, including service users and carers, educators, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers and academics. In this fifth seminar, we are pleased to welcome Gail Hornstein, an academic psychologist from America. Gail's book, Agnes Jacket, A Psychologist's Search for the Meanings of Madness, places service users' own accounts of their experiences at the heart of the treatment of mental illness. In this seminar, she asks the fundamental question, whose story counts, and argues that first-person narratives can offer a challenge to treatment orthodoxy and the role of professionals.
Agnes Richter was a woman living in Germany, near Dresden, in the 1880s. And before she had any mental health difficulties, she was a seamstress. So she was a professional maker of clothing. And she developed some ideas that probably would be called paranoid. She lived on her own. And in her 40s, she was developed these ideas that people were trying to steal her money, and she was taken by the police to an asylum, and she was never let out. She was there for the next 26 years until she died. As best as I can tell from a lot of research and trying to piece together her story, and the reason we know anything about this woman at all now, 100 years later, is because she took the uniform that she was given to wear in the mental institution. In the 19th century in Europe, patients had to wear uniforms like prisoners. And she took this uniform and she took it apart because she was a seamstress. I couldn't do this, but she knew how to do this. Took it apart and she reconstructed it into a very beautiful jacket. A jacket with a lot of decorative details, with very, very beautiful buttonholes and flared sleeves and a lot of details on it that only a skilled seamstress could create. And having made the jacket, she then embroidered, using 6 different colors of thread, the story of her life on this jacket. And she put it in every inch of the jacket. Much of the text is on the inside of the jacket, which she wore next to her skin, almost like a tattoo. It's on the sleeves, it's on the collar, it's on every inch of the jacket. And the writing is very, very compressed. There's almost no space between the ends of the words. Whether this was because she didn't have enough material, we don't know. It's very difficult to read this jacket. But the reason I use this jacket as the title of the book, and the reason I tell you about it now, is because what we do know about Agnes Richter was that she had an intense desire to tell her story. She created this jacket and this story under the most difficult possible conditions. We don't know why she used 6 colors of thread. Perhaps that was all she had. She was in a locked ward. So we know that she had an intense desire to tell her story, and we also know that it's very, very difficult for us to understand what that story is. I've spent years trying to decode this jacket. You can read about what I've been able to find out and what other people have been able to find out. But there's where I think is our challenge, that when people tell their accounts of madness, when they describe their lived experience, they have an intense desire very often to tell that story. Other people cannot always understand all of it, even any of it. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying in every possible way, because there is that story there, And whether we can make it out or not is not the key thing. Whether the person can tell it, I think, is really the key thing. And that's what I see in the case of someone like Agnes Richter, who I think would be absolutely astonished, I hope pleased, to find out 100 years later that here we are talking about her story. First of all, I'm emphasizing the existence of a huge body of material, some of it published, some of it in oral histories, some of it in other kinds of testimonies, in which people who have had lived experience of what gets called mental illness have provided accounts of their own experiences. From my own records, these have dated from at least the 15th century. Perhaps there are earlier ones. And there is a huge body of such material. We can't act as if there are no such things. That's my key first point. And if you want to use the language of social science, you can say this is a large body of data and theory about mental health and mental illness that has to be accounted for. It's there. We have to treat it seriously. That's point one. Second point, since there aren't any objective measures of mental illness, as we all know, there's no blood test you can take to find out if you have schizophrenia, there's no scan you can get, there's no way that we can assess someone's so-called mental illness on the basis of an objective measure. All we have is their behavior, their feelings, their actions, their thoughts. And since the claims that are made by psychiatrists in the DSM and other kinds of manuals are still very, very contentious, there's a lot of debate about them. There's a lot of disagreement about them, and you may know that DSM-5, the 5th edition of the DSM, is currently being formulated, and there's a huge fight going on. The publication date has already had to be put back by a year because psychiatrists cannot agree amongst themselves what diagnoses should be in there and what ones should be taken out. So I think I'm on strong ground here in saying DSM is a contentious document. It's not agreed upon. Since that's so problematic, and since there aren't any objective measures of mental illness, we talk about, evidence-based medicine, but the evidence base in psychiatry is very unclear. As a consequence of that, we see that the existence of first-hand accounts of madness provides a real alternative, or we could say a challenge, to the ideas of psychiatrists in a way that is not true in other fields of medicine. That's the second point. The third point, and I'll emphasize this because even though I think we all know this, it's very important to emphasize. No one knows what causes a person to break down, to have serious emotional difficulties, to experience distress, whatever we want to call it. No one knows. There are a lot of theories now, just like there have always been. But no one knows, and in particular, no one knows what leads a given individual to have the difficulties they have. And what I always say to students that I teach in psychology is that every method that has ever been developed in the history of psychiatry, ones that make sense to us, ones that seem bizarre to us, every method that's ever been developed works for some people and does not work for other people. This includes throwing people into pits of snakes, using medications, using shock treatments of every kind, lobotomy, psychotherapy, CBT, anything you can think of. It works for some people, but it doesn't work for others. And no one knows the causes of emotional distress. Because that's all true, I think we have to take a modest, open-minded approach and say, whatever ideas that anybody has to suggest ought to be taken seriously. because it's not as if we have any certain knowledge in this field. So if someone like Liz Pitt is writing a paper about her experiences of suspicion and can contribute some insights to our understanding of paranoia, why shouldn't we pay attention to those? It's not as if we already understand paranoia and it's all clear and she has nothing to contribute. It's the opposite. We understand very little about it. So why shouldn't we be paying attention to the ideas that everyone has to contribute? And finally, let me say to those of you who are mental health professionals here or are training to be mental health professionals, psychotherapy, counseling, CBT, any form of help from a professional can be very, very useful to people if it's voluntary, if it's freely chosen by the person who's seeking help, receiving services. Diagnosis in and of itself, I think, is not so helpful to people. But again, I think we have to take a modest attitude and say that whatever it is that a person in distress might find useful should be considered as a possibility. So I don't in any way want to be considered to be criticizing the help from professionals. I think professionals can often provide absolutely essential help, as long as it's voluntary and not coercive. That's the key thing. But most importantly, I think that we should appreciate, as I said before, that we're living in a very, very interesting time in the history of mental health. We're living at a time when for the first opportunity in history, accounts of madness and coping with difficulties suggested and provided by people with first-hand experience can provide a real alternative, a viable alternative to the accounts of professionals. And I think that's a very, very exciting moment to be living in.